Good morning. My name is Stephen Nolan, Managing Director of the UNDP-convened Financial Centres for Sustainability and also Chair of this year's Climate Finance Week. It's a real honour to have you all with us here today, discussing a very important topic, financing Ireland's agricultural sector net zero transition. This is part of, as I said, the third day of Climate Finance Week, which is focused on the COP26, climate and the race to net zero. We've got a phenomenal panel with us here today. We've got Russell Smith, Partner and Lead Sustainable Futures within KPMG Ireland. We've got Cathal O'Connor, Business Unit Head, AIB Corporate Banking, and we've got Cathal Fitzgerald, Senior Investment Director, Food and Agriculture at Ireland Strategic Investment Fund at the NTMA. Gentlemen, delighted to have you all with us today. An important topic. Everybody looks fantastic there on the screen. Thanks. The way we're going to play this today, guys, is we're going to have Russell give us a presentation, which will kind of set the scene to dive into some questions, the panelist questions, as we move through this morning's session. So Russell, I believe you're in Belfast, so delighted to have you with us today. And maybe I can ask you to just introduce yourself and then dive into your presentation, please.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Yep, dialing in from Belfast this morning. As Stephen said, I'm a partner in KPMG Ireland. I lead our dedicated sustainability and decarbonisation advisory practice called KPMG Sustainable Futures. And we work across all sectors supporting on the decarbonisation agenda. Agriculture, however, is probably our busiest sector, and it's a sector that we know has among the largest challenges, but it's also a sector that is very much alive to its challenges and very keen to find a solution. So I'm just going to give a short 10-minute presentation just to set the scene for our discussion and some of the observations and issues that we've seen emerge over recent years. So in terms, first of all, just to set the scene, in terms of the scale of the sector and just to highlight how important this sector is to Ireland. So the agricultural sector employs around 165,000 employees. That's around 7% of all employment in Ireland. So that is a phenomenally important sector. In terms of GVA, it's producing around 15 billion of GVA, 14 to 15 billion of GVA, and that's again around 4%. So again, it just sets the scene as to how important this is, both from an employment perspective and an economic prosperity perspective. We export around 14.5 billion. And what's interesting is that's about 85% of the produce that's produced in Ireland. So Ireland, as people would say, is the breadbasket of Europe. The sector, though, is very diverse, and the number of farms that make up Ireland's agri-sector, 137,000. So that's an awful lot of farms. The average size is very small, 32 hectares. And that's certainly one of the features of this sector and one of the features of the challenge here. There's an awful lot of small, of subscale, and trying to transition that many farms, that many farming activities is certainly challenging. It's also, while it's a big economic powerhouse, the actual average farm income is pretty small. And as I'll show in a later slide, the profitability across Irish farming varies dramatically from scale and actual subsector. So just from those stats, really, just to highlight, this is a phenomenally important sector for Ireland, and managing the transition will impact an awful lot of people and have an awful lot of economic consequences. So in terms of the climate and environmental performance, so agriculture is the single largest contributor to Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. On the graphic there, you can see it accounts for just over 1/3 of all GHG emissions in the country, and that is remarkable. That is significantly ahead of the European average, which is closer to 9 or 10%. And that's down to the fact that we do produce an awful lot of products for export. But it means that the agricultural challenge, while it is a challenge across Europe, is particularly challenging for the Irish economy, and the Irish economy is at the forefront of the agricultural decarbonisation journey. What makes it challenging and what makes it a very hard journey to go upon is looking at the nature and the breakdown of the agricultural emissions. So while some of it comes from likes of urea application and liming and fuel combustion, all things that can be addressed with technology and practice changes, north of 50% comes from enteric fermentation, which is effectively the methane emissions coming from animals, and that is what makes it so hard. That is a natural process, and while there are technologies which we'll mention in a second that are looking to address that, it is still a particularly hard element of the emissions to address. Greenhouse gas emissions, though, is only one part of the environmental challenge for agriculture. Agricultural does have other impacts, and for example, 25% of protected species and over 70% of protected habitats are impacted by agriculture and the agricultural practices that we are using in the country. And therefore, as well as looking to decarbonize the sector, we're also looking to bring in more sustainable practices that bring the wider environmental improvements, reduction in ammonia, nitrogen, for example. In terms of economic performance, then I mentioned a moment ago that this is a very diverse sector, and the economics varies across different subsectors. Approximately 1/3 of all farms in Ireland are considered to be economically vulnerable, and that does differ across the sector. So if you look on the graph there, dairy, for example, is one of the big outliers. So it is one of Ireland's success stories. The amount of farms that are economically viable is very strong in that sector, but that contrasts very sharply then if you look at beef and cattle. So cattle and beef, you're seeing the majority are either just about sustainable or vulnerable, and it's this divergence between sectors, the large number of subscale beef farms, which draws to a focus of how getting farmers to go on this journey, being able to afford to go on this journey and be able to make the investment that's required, is particularly challenging. You can see the reliance on direct payments. So dairy, while it's only 28% of farm income is coming from direct payments, that goes to over 100% for both cattle and sheep sectors. So again, very heavily reliant on direct payments. And obviously there is fundamental reshaping of those direct payments from Europe. This obviously hasn't passed by policymakers, and the agricultural sector is attracting probably more legislation, more policy initiatives than any other sector. And if we look just in the last sort of 12 months, even the amount of new legislation, of plans, of visions that have come out relevant to the Irish farming sector is quite incredible. Probably one of the first and guiding principles is the EU Farm to Fork strategy. And that Farm to Fork strategy is looking at not only decarbonisation, but the other wider environmental ambitions. So, for example, reduction in fertiliser use is at the heart of EU Farm to Fork. An increase in the amount of organic farming and EU carbon farming are all touched upon in the EU Farm to Fork. We then have Agri, which is the Irish government's implementation of some of the EU Farm to Fork legislation. And it's again following, targeting, for example, nitrogen use, to significant reduction in nitrogen use through to 2030, to reduce ammonia loss and to invest in novel areas such as reducing of biogenic methane. We then have obviously the Climate Action Development Bill, which has set into law Ireland's transition to net zero. And it's going to be establishing a series of economy-wide carbon budgets, and certainly the agricultural sector is sort of holding their breath to see what is placed upon it, first in the first 5-year budget, but also the long-term trajectory. And is agriculture going to be asked to achieve net zero by 2050 or not? We then have the Food Vision, which is a 10-year strategy for Ireland's agri-food sector, recognising not only its importance in terms of an economic driver, but also its need to become a sustainable system. And it's setting forward 22 goals, which include environment, sustainability, and climate at their heart. And then, so finally, we've got the CAP reform, and the CAP reform for the period 23-27, as we said, Ireland's agricultural system is very heavily dependent, certainly in subsectors, on the funding that comes through CAP, and the change in CAP and its refocus of payments. 20-25% of budget direct payments will be allocated towards eco schemes. About 40% of all CAP funding will be directed towards climate initiatives. So that is going to fundamentally change a lot of the funding that's flowing into the sector, that's going to encourage but also enable the transition. So, what are the opportunities to decarbonize the agricultural sector? So, we said it is very challenging. We've got the single hardest sector to decarbonize. What we'd say is we've done a fair bit of research, into this area, looking at a lot of work done by Teagasc, for example, and within the UK at the CCC. What we'd say is that there are some existing measures that are in place to allow farmers to reduce the GHG, what we call the low-hanging fruit. So there is some real easy wins that can be delivered by farmers that will not only reduce carbon emissions, but actually will improve their own productivity and their own economics. And easy things such as low emission slurry spreading would be one of those examples. It just makes sense for farmers to do. The challenge, however, in looking both at the Teagasc and the CCC and the UK's research, is those existing measures start running out of steam when you've decarbonised about 20% of the agricultural sector. And to go above 20% decarbonisation, which is a good step, but not far enough, you start having to look into novel measures, so measures that are not quite proven yet. And a lot of work is underway on looking at some of these more modern initiatives. So, for example, feed additives to reduce the amount of enteric methane emissions, the use of carbon farming, and potentially the adoption of anaerobic digestion across the country. We've also we're launching a report in conjunction with Devonish in the next week or so, which is looking at the role of multi-species swards, which is effectively replacing just ryegrass and a monoculture of grass with multiple species, potentially up to 12 or 15. And it brings, a lot of benefits, a lot less nitrogen use, a lot better climate adaptability. So there are a lot of novel measures, but at the moment we do not have proven ability to decarbonize the sector, and therefore, innovation is going to be key. We published a report last month looking at the Northern Ireland market and working on some of the analysis from the Climate Change Committee there. And interestingly, the Climate Change Committee in the UK is saying that at the moment, it is not possible to decarbonise Northern Ireland's agricultural system based on current technologies. And to quote Lord Debon, who's the chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee, and which is the advisory committee to the government, they're targeting only an 88% reduction in climate emissions in Northern Ireland by 2050 on the back of agriculture, in their mind, not being able to achieve it. So to quote Lord Debon, "We have taken into account the economic reliance on Agri in Northern Ireland and the fact that Northern Ireland exports much of its food it produces to the rest of the UK, and therefore, they're suggesting that Northern Ireland does not place an obligation on its agriculture sector to fully decarbonise." And, Lord Debon goes on, "We don't think it helps anyone to aim at something when all of the research, which has been done by very significant people working hard to get it right, say it can't be done." So that's very dramatic words. And, that is saying that based on current evidence, decarbonising agriculture, certainly in Northern Ireland, but it's not wholly different to the Republic of Ireland, can't be done. So that's a challenge laid before us, and certainly something that's very worthy of debate in our session this morning going forward. So on that, I'll conclude the presentation and pass back to Stephen. I'd be really interested to hear the panelists' views on some of these issues.
Thank you very much, Russell. This is why I love Climate Finance Week. Even though I work in this sector day in, day out, it's just phenomenal when you see a presentation like that, the work that KPMG is leading on, the different stats pulled together, and that very forceful narrative. So from what I picked up, I kind of picked up 9 points in terms of the agri sectors as the largest emitter. 165,000 employees, substantial across the whole of the 26 counties. 7% of all employees in Ireland, just staggering when you kind of put it in that frame. But then also just under €26,000 average farm income. And I know that's the average, but still incredibly low when one thinks about it. And then, but as you said, difference across sectors in terms of, obviously dairy is doing quite well, but other sectors or segments, within ag are quite economically vulnerable. An important sector, again, in terms of what it does, employees, what it represents from a societal perspective in Ireland as well. I think that's one of the key points you're kind of getting there. Climate Action Bill, will the agri sector be, push towards net zero by 2050 within that? The opportunities, and that's something I always go to, the opportunities, the glass is half full. And as you said there, innovation will be quite key. And I know we have your colleague Mike Hazen later on this week, and I know this is a key topic that Mike talks to, is the innovation, green innovation. But then, as you said, you use Northern Ireland as an example, which is super, not possible now, as you point out. But this goes back to the innovation perspective. So what may occur in the next number of years, because as you pointed out, policymakers, and you had that fantastic slide, there's a lot happening on the policy side, and therefore we will see more monies coming probably from the Exchequer to support innovation. And then, but as you all know, that takes a while to go down through the system. So thank you very much for that, Russell, and I will come back to you in a few minutes. Cathal, Cathal and ISIF. Sorry, I've got two Cathals today, so I'm going to be going AIB Cathal and ISIF AIB, or ISIF Cathal. Sorry guys, I'm already getting myself confused. ISIF a few weeks ago, not a few weeks ago, you've always been very supportive of what is happening in the agriculture sector in Ireland. Your mandate as an entity around also supporting economic, society and so on in Ireland. And then a few weeks ago on the NIC, you announced €1 billion investment over the next number of years to support climate action in Ireland. How can you, or how are you supporting Irish-based farmers in their decarbonisation transition? A very big question, but it'd be great if you could maybe respond to that, please, Cathal.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for the opportunity of presenting here this morning. I suppose just for the benefit of viewers, just a little bit about the ISIF fund. We're a strategic investment fund of the government. We invest on a commercial basis, but to generate economic impact within the island of Ireland. And we have 5 priority themes: regional, indigenous, Brexit, climate change, and housing. And 4 of those touch on agriculture. And as you rightly mentioned, Stephen, climate change is one of those, and agriculture is a key part of climate change. And we have a dedicated food and ag team within that. And we have been working on this area for quite a number of years, because we've seen this coming down the track within the fund, the issues. And I suppose we recognise that solutions, they're going to take time to develop. This is not an easy area to decarbonise, which Russell very clearly outlined. And I suppose if you go back to the targets that originally arose or came out of the Paris Agreement in 2016, in the non-ETS sector, which is where, in the effort sharing area where agriculture is positioned, agriculture is one of the larger parts of that. In agriculture and transport are 73% of that. But interesting, when the targets were handed down by Europe, 40% was the standard target. Ireland got 30% because there was a recognition of the higher proportion, as Russell mentioned, of agriculture within the overall ETS and the difficulty of decarbonising that. So we got 30% of a target within that. So that's kind of recognition from a policy perspective across Europe within that framework. We know now the game has moved on to the climate bill to 51%, and we'll see ultimately pretty soon, I guess, where that will lie in terms of a target. But I suppose that is a starting point. And I suppose I would throw in one other thing, and I'll come on I will address your question in a second. Within that, I think there is a recognition within Europe, within the policymakers, that Europe is, in general, an efficient place to produce food. In general, we have the lowest carbon footprint across the globe of producing food. And interesting, if you look to Article 2 within the Paris Agreement, which is often not highlighted, there is a provision in there that the decarbonisation agenda shouldn't create, in essence, carbon leakage. It shouldn't reduce production in carbon efficient regions, which Europe is, and Ireland is within that. And we mentioned dairy. Dairy has the lowest carbon footprint. Irish dairy production has the lowest carbon footprint within Europe, and Europe has the lowest carbon footprint within the world. So there's a conundrum there. National targets would say you need to reduce it, but globally, well, we are the most efficient. So naturally, you would say if you're taking a global perspective, you'd shift more production into the more efficient regions. And just to put that in context, if all the milk in the world was produced in Europe, there's 280 million cows, you'd only need 75 million cows. That kind of puts in context and even adds another layer of context onto the challenge. If we look then, the specific measures, where can we help? So the blueprint that's on the table at the moment, and I'm sure to be revised following the budgets, the Chagos-Mack curve, and within that there's 3 blocks of measures. The agricultural measures, the land use, and energy are the kind of 3 blocks. Within the agriculture measures, we've productivity gains from animal genetics, both on the beef and the dairy side, and on-farm energy and support, but all within the farm manure and nutrient management, all of that area. So one area where we can help in that, we've a number of years ago launched a fund called Milflex, which is a program to lend to expanding dairy farmers. Now, in the initial years of that was in essence to support the expansion program of dairy farmers. It's unsecured loans. It's the loans are over 8 to 10 years, as I said, unsecured and a competitive rate. That has now been expanded 2 years ago to include environmental measures within farms, so farmers can avail of that. And interestingly, in the last 2 years, we've 2,500 farmers now on that program, which is very successful. The 33% of the uptake has been for environmental and sustainability measures, which shows the shift that's happening, and we expect that shift to increase further going forward. On the land use side, we've to date, our main contribution here has been on the forestry side. We have a Forestry Fund that has been investing in consolidating private sector, but also afforestation. And we are currently revising that program and looking where else can we be additive on the forestry side. Technology has been mentioned, and technology is very important. And a number of years ago, we invested in an agtech fund, Finisterre Ventures, and they themselves are part of the remit of that fund is to look at new emerging technologies such as sensors for nutrient management, and drones and satellite imagery to monitor progress on farms on various measures. Alternative proteins is a key investment area, and there's investments in that area, a company called Memphis Meats, but also, and then vertical farming. So they're the kind of areas that we're looking. Through them, they have accelerators they manage accelerators for the New Zealand government in New Zealand, and also for the Israeli government based in Israel, which gives us exposure to a lot of new emerging companies and technologies, both on the ag tech and food tech side. Just in terms of the pipeline, as I mentioned, it's a multi-year program. So that's what we've done to date. In the pipeline, again, projects that we've been ongoing for the last number of years. On the energy side, we're involved with the industry and Russell, who's done a huge amount of work on the area of the biomethane, Project Clover. We've been involved in that project from the very start, and we're committed to supporting industry and the farming community. Ultimately, it may be a farmer-based model. It remains to be seen ultimately where that project will go, because it's waiting on some policy pronouncements that may come later in the year. So that's an area that we can help with capital. We have a flexible capital structure. So we can do debt, equity, or mezzanine. We can sculpt it. We can invest in the long term. It's one of our differentiating factors is the term and tenor of our funding. So we can be flexible, and our model is to partner with people who have the knowledge in this area. As I mentioned, Russell and his team in KPMG have demonstrated that, and we work closely with them, but also with industry and anybody who has good ideas. Carbon farming has been touched on. We're doing quite a lot of work with industry on carbon farming and what does that mean, and how can that be mobilized for the benefit of industry, mobilized for the benefit of farmers. At first instance, 90% of the GHG footprint in the full supply chain is on farm. So whether you're a corporate or whether you're a farmer, ultimately the goal is to decarbonize the full supply chain. So that's important. So we've done quite a lot of work in there. The challenge there is the measurement, reporting, and verification to get the benefit, whether it's you're trying to get carbon certificates or whether you're trying to get it included in the national inventory. And there is a lot of work ongoing, and the CAP has and the Green Deal has referenced that, and there's a lot of kind of templates from the EU of pilots that are currently being looked at. I would also highlight the fact that CAP has in the new budget, 25% of Pillar 1 is allocated to environmental measures, which roughly translates to about 300 million will be for environmental measures. So I know the department are looking at how that can be deployed in a manner which will stimulate other finance to come in, and that's something we'll certainly be keeping close communication with the department as they progress through that particular area. And the other area is alternative crops. Is an area we do quite a bit of work on in terms of what alternative crops could be grown in Ireland. How could we scale those if there are crops that have a specific application that can be used in the industry? Then how can we scale those? How can we put investment behind that? And that brings you into the area of biorefining and the circular economy. So they're all areas that we're working on with industry partners, and we're happy if there's anybody on this call today who have ideas in that area to contact us. It doesn't have to be fully finalized or vetted. We can go on the journey and help people form it, and maybe bring in other people to assist as well. This is all a journey. The solutions here in this sector is going to be through collaboration. These are difficult areas to crack. We can provide one part of it, which is a flexible capital solution. As you mentioned earlier, Stephen, we've set out an ambition to invest up to $1 billion. Within that, we can leverage in other capital sources, so that $1 billion can be multiplied by bringing in other capital providers, and we can provide the enabling piece to get the project going. So those, I hope I've given you a flavour of the areas that we can help, and I would certainly encourage anybody here to reach out to us with ideas, and we'll certainly engage positively on that.
Great. Thank you very much, Cathal. And I think, I've dealt with the NTMA as an entity a lot over the last number of years, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, but the excellence within the NTMA, across everything. I'm thinking about JP Corkery in New Era, I'm looking at Mark Merrigan on the bond side, Emma Jane Joyce, obviously on the responsible investment, and then obviously Frank O'Connor's leadership within that. So, it's great to have you on the call today, but I think for a lot of people, what you've just gone through, it's quite staggering. Actually, when one thinks about it, what the NTMA and within the NTMA ISIF is actually doing and is supporting, it is phenomenal, and it was great to see Nick's statement a few weeks ago about that $1 billion. But if I can now just switch across to AIB, Cathal, largest bank in Ireland, a lot happening in Cathal as well. But I want to come to the point, to something that Cathal and ISIF just said there a moment ago. I'm using the term crowding in private capital, but can you just give us a sense of where AIB is in this area, please, Cathal?
Cheers. Thanks, Stephen, and good morning. Good morning to my fellow panelists and also anyone who's taken the time to join us this morning. It's a significant topic and a significant challenge. And if you do happen to ask any particularly difficult questions, Stephen, I'm just going to assume it's Cathal Fitzgerald you're directing those questions to. But I do just want to touch on one or two points that's come up so far through Russell's discussion and what Cathal has been saying, and the direction of travel and what we need to achieve by 2050, and even with checkpoints in along the way as part of the carbon budgets at a sectoral level that's due to land over the coming weeks. It's important to recognise where the industry is today and where it's come from, and if we go back 30 or 40 years. And ask ourselves the question, would Ireland as a country and the industry have got to a point where it's exporting 85% of its produce at 15 billion, employing 167,000 with 7% of the workforce. And that 7% probably does a little bit of a disservice to the overall importance of the industry to Ireland as a nation, because you have multiple families hanging out of that 7% and a significant number of ancillary small businesses and large businesses that support the sector. It's a hugely significant industry for Ireland, and it has multiple stakeholders. And even from a banking perspective in an AIB context, the primary agricultural portfolio is singularly the largest area of support at personal and micro business level, and even then up through business banking into our corporate book, it is the largest sector that we support as a nation. And what the country has done over the last 30 or 40 years to position our brands, our export markets, the reputation of the country, and the value of that to our local economy, and doing it in a comparatively sustainable way is quite significant. So, and it's been delivered through multiple cycles of various different challenges, whether that be financial crisis or any number of other commodity market related challenges. It's consistently proved itself to be resilient through strong leadership from farm gate right through to industry level. So as we stand today and look out over the next 20 to 30 years, the interesting thing in this whole area is that there's rarely been a time in history where there's been global solidarity around a particular initiative. I don't think, picking up on Russell's point, that it's right to start on the footing of saying, no, we can't do this. Well, actually, we probably don't have a choice. It's something that requires a collective effort across all of industry, across all of government, with all stakeholders, to move this along at pace. And again, standing at the foothills of a fairly steep climb, the first part of this is probably going to be the easy wins and the low-hanging fruit. And there are big question marks over what type of technologies and what type of supports are required to get to the final number of yards as we approach 2050. And that's going to be through a number of cycles of leadership in industry and a customer level. But from a supports perspective, again, what we've seen is the last number of years has really been about information gathering, education, upskilling within AIB to support the farming community. A lot of research and activity on the ground through the likes of supporting the Chagas Signpost Series, Land Association, investment into AgTech UCD, and other initiatives with DCU, and more recently the sustainability chair within UCC. So all of that is bringing insight together, which should culminate in time in landing on different types of activity and innovations. Our Agri advisors on the ground working at Farmgate are spending a lot of time on one-to-one clinics to see what type of supporting activity and supporting funding and finance is required, and what does that mean from an emissions perspective. And the bit that we're not there yet on as a country is really having robust, solid data. So at Farmgate level, at industry level, and at a country level, that can be tested and used to bring that comparability to other food producing sectors, because carbon leakage is a challenge here, because we can decide to do one thing to reduce our emissions, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're improving the climate for the world, and that's a really important point. The other piece, just to highlight, Stephen, is that the other side of the equation is that population is going to grow significantly by over 2 billion over this period as well. So there is opportunity there in finding the right market and finding the right positioning for a highly sustainable, high quality produce into various different markets, and that potentially should theoretically flow through in terms of margin positioning for the quality of produce that we produce in Ireland.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that, Carl. Highly sustainable, high quality, hopefully high margin product. That's your last point there. And you mentioned skills and data as well during your intervention there, and that's something that I'm seeing at a global level. The challenge around scaling up sustainable finance activities into every sector. There's a lack of talent around the sustainable finance space. It's growing. AIB themselves have put a significant investment into developing a talent base on top of what you have here. Russell, I know last week your global lead announced a $1.5 billion investment, $1.5 billion investment into ESG for KPMG. How can you upskill all 230,000 staff KPMG globally, including the 3,000 here on the island of Ireland? And then obviously, Cathal with an ISOF, again, it's upskilling a lot of leaders in this space as well. So, but you couple Cathal, AIB's Cathal, you couple that, as you said, with the data challenge and a skills challenge. Well, then we're going to lag on a product development challenge, right? And so that's kind of the big issue right now around scaling up sustainable finance products and services are among the issues. Russell, and I love what Cathal just said there as well, that kind of collective choice. And as you said, and you were at pains to stress it, right now, as in now, we have a challenge about achieving net zero. But innovation, and ISIF's Cathal spoke to that as well, and they're investing in that space. So you're not closing the door and saying this ain't going to happen. It's actually where we are now. Let's have a reality check. But we do all, as Cathal said, want to collectively achieve that. So from a government perspective, because policy plays a key role in this, from a government perspective over the coming years, what do you think government should be focused on in terms of agricultural policy to affect the biggest change in agricultural sustainability, please, Russell?
Yeah, so I think, the fact that we do have an ability using known proven technologies to decarbonize 20% of agriculture, fairly quickly. So policy has to focus on driving and supporting farmers to understand, to embrace, to fund and make those, early wins. And if we can reduce Ireland's agricultural emissions by 20%, like that's still going to be phenomenal. So that's the first step. Policy has to support that initial adoption and journey. Secondly, then it's back to this word innovation. So unless we create new innovative solutions, we will struggle to get past that 20%. So there has to be policy support to drive that innovation. That's innovation in carbon farming, as I mentioned. It's innovation in anaerobic digestion. It's innovation. And there is some fabulous innovation happening. Carberry, for example, we've had the pleasure of working with them on their zero dairy carbon farming initiative. And they're doing some fabulous work, which is showing some really innovative, solutions, and is showing opportunity and gives sort of visibility of how you go beyond that 20%. Working with Devonish at the research farm in Meath, and their approach to different ways of farming and of crop management and land management. So it's about delivering the proven technologies and then funding innovation to drive it. That's where policy needs to focus in my mind.
Great, thank you for that, Russell. Cathal and ISIF, I can just spin to you now, and I'm conscious of time, and we're coming shortly to a close of this panel. But Cathal, in ISIF, there's a lot happening in ISIF. You've gone through that. On a personal level, where ISIF was, or the NTMA 10 years ago, even the last 3 years on this agenda, I personally feel that ISIF has been recognised as a critical cog in Ireland's decarbonisation efforts. What are you seeing over the next 2-3 years when ISIF's journey in this space? And when you look at that billion, obviously it's going to be around deal flow and what comes to you, but how big in terms of the agricultural sector focus is going to be for you over the next 2-3 years, please?
It's going to be a very important area for us, and it is and will be a big focus. I suppose what we want to do is partner with industry and provide solutions that industry want. So we mentioned Project Clover earlier. That's about the decarbonisation of heat within the dairy and drink sector. So that's one area we've put out there that we're involved in. On decarbonisation of the electricity side, we have a fund Temporis. I know they'll be speaking later on. They're ready to engage with corporate PPAs with any corporate. So they're, to Russell's point earlier, these could be low hanging fruit that could be actioned pretty quickly. One through a policy change, and the other through engaged by industry. The on forestry, that's an area. If you look at the planting rates are down below 3,000 hectares. If we maintain at that, we're going to have a serious negative post 2030. So forestry has to be a priority area, and we are reshaping. We've reformulated our existing forestry strategy to focus in on that. Technology has been mentioned. We're doing a huge amount of work on technology areas, and if I was to pick out one that could be really enabling to even the low hanging, will be a platform to help measure and verify the impact of, let's say, multi-species swards on farms in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of nutrient runoff. I think that's going to be critical going forward, that we have a technology platform that measures and verifies the actions that farmers take on farm. And there's a number of benefits that will come out of that. One, that farmers will be able to show and demonstrate the impact, and whether it ultimately ends up in accrediting carbon through carbon farming programs that hopefully will be developed and will come out, but probably more importantly demonstrate to customers of the dairy or beef companies or others that there are proper sustainability credentials on farm, and you can trace it right back to farm. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing through our AgTech Fund and other technology providers is around trying to get the technologies around a platform that can move us onto a level where you can scientifically or measure to scientific standards and verify the impact of all these measures on farm. Because we can do all the measures on farm, but if we can't measure and verify it, then it won't be counted, and it won't be counted in our national inventory. And I think if I was to pick out one area from a policy perspective, putting in the technology, whether it's national LiDAR scanning, whether that should be part of the national development plan, whatever the enabling infrastructure is to enable those technology platforms, and maybe enable a couple of competing ones to come in using the same platform. That's one I'd certainly call out, because technology, as we mentioned earlier, this is a difficult area to decarbonize. And at all times in the past, technology has provided a solution to issues that were at first very difficult to achieve. So I think that is one area that I think we as a country need to focus on.
Thank you, Cathal. And so again, the data point there, and it's not just Ireland that is having a challenge around this, as said earlier on, skills, data equals products. But I think, as you're saying there, Cathal, we need to see a surge in investment in the coming years, right? And there's an abundance of capital. So let's not, this isn't the shortage of capital issue, there's an abundance. But as you point out, if you don't have the data, how can you actually make an investment decision or scale up on something? So it's just great to see ISIF's leadership in that. Cathal and AIB, if I could just come to you, because again, you've mentioned skills, you mentioned collectively we need to make a choice here. We've touched on data and product. And if I can actually just stay with you in terms of product, from a customer perspective, what are you seeing? You mentioned your advisors that are out there dealing with the farmers themselves on a personal basis. What are you seeing from a customer perspective, and how is that feeding into your product development, and how is that shaping up? So there's a few questions within that. I hope you don't mind. It's kind of a broad question, Cathal, but what are you seeing there, please?
It's a fair question, Stephen, and thanks. I suppose where we've seen the most immediate momentum and most immediate progress over the last, now bearing in mind certainly at industry and manufacturing and food manufacturing level, and Farmgate, the sector has been focused on sustainability for 10 plus years, but it's only really in the last 3 years it's come centre to company and business strategy. And from a financing perspective, at the large enterprise level, what we've seen is significantly more activity around green lending. So that's more asset specific, whether it be building or industry placing on-site renewable energy type installations. But increasingly, we're actually seeing a lot more progress in sustainability linked loans. Now, sustainability linked loans are typically for general purposes, cover a suite of different products, but they are linked to very specific sustainability and climate action metrics, and in some cases also social and governance to cover the whole of the ESG spectrum. So what we've seen to date is probably, funding facilities being put in place which are tied to a large degree to carbon emissions, water intensity, food to or waste to landfill, and packaging and plastics. And with the emissions component of it, to date, it's principally been around Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. But what we'd expect to see over the next couple of years, certainly from 2023 onwards, is that we'll start to incorporate much more of what's happening in Scope 3, which is more downstream, and probably gets through to the more Farmgate level. And Russell mentioned that there's significant research and activity being deployed by industry. Carberry was referenced as an example. We can see very progressive work under the auspices of Origin Green and some of the data that's likely to start coming through on that. And in the midst of all of that, from a banking perspective, you have the rule of law that's kind of coming in front and centre, and you'll see increasing disclosures from 2023 onwards, which means that banks will start to heat map and position certain sectors. So agriculture will be in there, and what are the mitigating strategies that the industry is taking to ensure that we're on track for climate action. So at the minute, it's kind of green loans, sustainability linked loans, and at primary level, there's a lot of funding available from all banks, not just AIB, for any on-farm initiatives that will help on that sustainability journey. They will evolve at pace over the next couple of years.
Great, thank you for that, Cathal. And I just, again, I know at the beginning of this week, Colin, CEO of AIB, announced a doubling of your fund around climate from 5 billion to 10 billion. We saw earlier on this year the AIB Green Bond. And so, to your point, there is more demand. Therefore, AIB is increasing the capital that it can actually put into not just this sector, but this sector is included in terms of climate action. And we also yesterday had the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, Governor Magluf, talk for the first time with Professor Alan Barrett on this agenda. And I do think as well, we mentioned stress testing there. We're going to see from a regulatory perspective, climate stress testing. We're seeing regulators around the world, including Ireland, really step up their activities in space. The Central Bank of Ireland has created a climate change unit, so they're staffing up themselves as well. But look, Russell, we started with you today, so I want to end with you today and let you all get on with your day. I just know from a personal level, working with KPMG Ireland and around the world, big focus, as I said earlier on skills, upstaffing, data, the research you mentioned that Cathal just linked to, and obviously innovation. And Sustainable Futures was one of the, I'm not going to say it was a pilot, but because it was done within KPMG Ireland, but I know the rest of KPMG globally were looking at the model of Sustainable Futures and how you brought it together. And it's great to see that now being actually rolled out around the world, which is just super for Ireland to actually be able to have that kind of bragging right. But you also have that perspective here in Ireland, north and south, as the guys are saying, not just at the AIB, at ISIF, but Carberry and other clients. Where are you seeing the next 12 to 18 months, Russell, if I may, in terms of, are we going to see a surge here? What do you think is going to happen over the next 12 months, please, Russell?
Yeah, I think the carbon budget, when it's announced, it's going to be a real catalyst, and I think it's going to put definitive targets. And when people have definitive targets, it gives them sort of the confidence and the need to react. So I think the carbon budget coming out, we're going to see a huge amount of momentum. We're talking with a huge number of corporates. We do what's called a global CEO survey, and 5 years ago, climate didn't even register in the top 10. 3 years ago, it was in the top 10, but maybe number 5. In this year's survey, it's now the number 1 issue on corporates' agenda. And when we speak to Irish corporates in the Agri sector, it is now, pretty much the number 1 issue. Every single board, every single executive is talking about this issue. So we are just going to see a continued acceleration. More has happened on this issue in the last 12 months than has happened in the 30 years before it. And I suspect we're going to see more in the next 3 months than the 12 months before that. So this is an agenda item which is ramping up, which is now firmly on the corporate CEO's agenda, and that is going to drive real change.
Great, thank you very much for that, Russell. And again, it's a very positive note to end on. I want to take this moment to thank the panel, Cathal and AIB, Cathal and ISIF, and obviously Russell and KPMG in Belfast with us today. I've learned a lot from this session today. There's way more that we need to do in this area, as we all recognise. Innovation at the core of that. Innovation itself is a word that's perhaps misused nowadays. It's incredibly broad. What does it mean? But I think Cathal and ISIF, you give us some really firm examples of what you're doing and how you're supporting that. Within Cathal and AIB, in terms of what you're seeing from the customer perspective and what customers are looking at and the more increasing sustainability linked loans. And then Russell, in terms of kind of just setting the scene, because I think sometimes we forget in terms of our climate action agenda that fundamentally this is about people as well. And it's not just people at a global level, people in Ireland. It's, as you said there, somebody said it earlier on, is within that 7% of employees in Ireland in this sector, there's a lot of families within that. And we also have to, take a moment to kind of look at this transition and the impact it's going to have society. But to Colin and AIB's point, we need to do it. And there's, Colin earlier on in AIB earlier this week said we have to do it, and the time frame to do it is shorter as well. So I want to thank you all, Russell, Cathal and Cathal, for being with us today as part of Climate Finance Week. And obviously Russell, delighted KPMG was our knowledge partner this week as well. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thanks a lot.